This episode is powered by Fuse Energy.
And there's a slight tendency to governments to talk about the future of energy as though it's some distant concept awaiting its next committee report. But in reality, of course, it's already being built, field by field, turbine by turbine, by companies like Fuse Energy.
And Fuse is now the fastest growing renewable energy supplier in the UK, putting sustainability at the heart of everything they do. Their new solar and wind farm projects are helping to build a cleaner, more resilient national grid, proving that renewable energy can be both affordable and scalable.
Every home that they power brings that future close to the present, whether it's panels catching light or turbines turning across the country. And this is progress which isn't measured just in targets and slogans, but in sunlight, in wind, in electricity, and a bit of British persistence.
And progress is not always about shouting the loudest. It's about keeping the lights on intelligently and making clean energy something that everyone can afford.
The energy transition isn't tomorrow's problem. It's today, and Fuse Energy is actually doing something to address it.
So switch to Fuse Energy today using the code POLITICS to save on your energy bills and help power a cleaner, more sustainable future.
Welcome to the Rest is Politics. Me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. Now, one of the questions we asked our audiences on our recent tour is this: are we witnessing the birth of a fascist USA? It's really interesting. Every audience was roughly the same. The highest was Glasgow. 82% agreed with that proposition, 18% disagreed, but it was above 70% everywhere.
Yeah.
That's quite a big statement. Are we witnessing the birth of a fascist USA?
And of course, it's something that triggers people on the right, that kind of response. It even used to trigger your friend Tony Blair.
I think it still does trigger him a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes think, I use words like proto-fascist because I don't want to get drawn into the people excusing Donald Trump on the grounds that he's not Hitler. I mean, obviously he's not Hitler, but that doesn't mean that what he's doing is not unbelievably dangerous and troubling. One of the ways, though, of talking about it is to look at Trump's coalition. So traditionally, we've talked about Trump's coalition as having three bits to it. Tech bros, like Musk, or your friend Curtis Yarvin.
Brackets, not my friend.
Second group, the broad kind of MAGA base, which is tens of millions of voters, and therefore pretty diverse, all the way from white, less educated communities with economic anxieties right the way through to black Pentecostal churches in some cases and school mums on the other side. And then finally, this group called Christian nationalists. And we haven't spoken much about them. And of course, the reason we're talking about them today is that Nick Fuentes was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and then there was a massive attack by Ben Shapiro. Now, just to explain to people who don't get into the weeds of all this, Nick Fuentes is a young influencer with genuinely fascist views. He's on record saying a lot of women want to be raped. They want men to beat the shit out of them. He talked about the Jim Crow laws, saying, big deal, blacks weren't allowed to drink from water fountains. Who cares? It's just a water fountain. He said that Jews are responsible for every war in the world, and they must be absolutely annihilated when we take power. So this is Nick Fuentes. He was platformed on Tucker Carlson. So Tucker Carlson interviewed him for a long time. That's a big show. And Ben Shapiro, who is a Trump-sympathetic right-wing podcaster, then attacked, exposing all these divisions within the setup. It then led me down this path of getting a sense of Christian nationalism. What's your sense of Christian nationalism? Before I start ranting on.
Well, I'm fascinated by this obsession that the Christian right, which Trump is responding to, have with Nigeria. So the Nigerian thing, they basically say that Christians are being persecuted. Now, there's 50-50 Christians and Muslims, and there is some interethnic, interreligious violence, no doubt about that. But to say that this is a level of persecutions against Christians, which requires the American administration to intervene, given all the things they don't intervene, in a continent, by the way, that I think Donald Trump has never visited, certainly never visited as president, which I think shows you where he puts Africa in his scale of priorities. I have been stunned, and I don't know how it's happened, that the Christian right is the Christian right. I always, perhaps this is just my bias, but I've always assumed that Jesus was a socialist. I certainly think he had pretty socialist outlook and principles and what have you. When you see these pictures of Trump with all these sort of evangelical pastors sort of laying their hands on him and seeing him like, a second coming of Christ. What I found really interesting when we were on tour, we got lots of questions about AI, and you were doing this big series for Rest is Politics members on AI, and I sense you're on a journey of becoming much, much more sceptical, where in a sense you're becoming into something of an alliance with the Christian right because you see them as being scared of this because it's going to eat into whatever it is that they believe. So unbundle that one for me.
Yeah, well, so firstly, I think you're right. This is an amazing reminder how different America is to Britain. In Britain, as I often point out to Americans, the church is often seen as a pretty left-wing. Famously, conservative governments always getting really annoyed with bishops.
Well, the American bishops produced a video this week, did they not? That was really quite powerful about the operations of ICE.
Absolutely. Attacking exactly what Trump is doing in terms of the brutal treatment of immigrants and the way in which churches are being violated as places of sanctuary, etc.
And the Pope came out with a very powerful statement about COP and condemned the lack of global leadership. Well, I think he means the leaders who didn't turn up.
Right. So if you're from the Christian nationalist right, you see this as part of all your institutions being taken over by woolly liberals. So increasingly there would be anti-bishops, anti-university professors, anti-bankers. They talk in one bit of the Christian nationalist movement about the seven mountains. They're almost like Marxists. They define all these big institutions that they need to take over from government to education. This was something that Charlie Kirk was associated with. In fact, in some ways, Charlie Kirk, man that was assassinated in this horrible incident, shows you some of the links between these groups. He was somebody who began in some ways as a sort of tech bro enthusiast, then became very much part of the MAGA base, and then very much embraced Christian nationalism. This part of America, though, and I was talking to a Daily Telegraph journalist called Tim Stanley, who has written articles about this and has also written an article on Timothy McVeigh, written a book actually on Timothy McVeigh, and the links to the 1990s Christian militia movements in the United States, where a lot of this comes from. I was also talking to a priest who was my local priest called, you'll like this name, he's called Father Yaroslav Skywalker. And they were both trying to help me understand.
So what's his I need to know more about Father Yaroslav Skywalker.
So I think his parents are partly Russian and partly Star Wars fans, I think is the way to interpret what's happening there. So what they're both pointing out is that you have to understand that there's a much stronger tradition in the United States, firstly of fundamentalism, but secondly of reading books like the Book of Apocalypse and believing that what we might see as sort of poetic language is in fact direct prophecy about the current day. And in this view, the Christian nationalists are not saying Trump is Jesus. What they're saying is that he is like one of these Old Testament kings who ushers in the moment of the second coming. And actually, he might be, they acknowledge, personally quite evil, but he's a sort of enabler for this moment. And then you get into even stranger moments, which is that if you're Mick Huckabee, who's the American ambassador to Israel...
Oh yeah, he's a real second coming man.
Right, then you believe in various things such as, for example, there's going to be some new movement in Jerusalem, the temple is going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. A lot of this is taken from the Book of Revelations. And when all this gets together, you suddenly see breaks within that movement. So Nick Fuentes, who's a Christian nationalist, but he's a very extreme Christian nationalist, he's a Christian nationalist who seems to believe in a Catholic theocracy. He doesn't believe in democracy at all. He wants, effectively, America to be administered by a sort of Pope figure.
Well, that's what Curtis Yarvik wants. He thinks J.D. Vance should be the monarch.
Should be a king, yeah. And maybe without the theology, but it's sort of similar. And the only reason why this matters is you could say these people are fringe people who don't matter at all, but Rod Dreher, again, who's somebody who you wouldn't have any truck with at all, he's an American intellectual, he's very close to Viktor Orban and has moved to Hungary. He has just come back from Washington completely shocked to discover that he claims 30 to 40% of Republican staffers are listening to Nick Fuentes, listening to this man who says women should shut up, Jews control everything, and most black people should be in jail.
Oh, it's pretty terrifying, isn't it? Just back to fascism. So Umberto Eco, whose definition of fascism is one of the...
Blimey, you've become a real European intellectual. Umberto Eco, where are we going next? Michel Foucault?
Sorry, am I not allowed to be, just because you want to be a public intellectual doesn't mean that other people aren't already public intellectuals. No, but let's just go through them one by one. The principles of fascism as he defines them: a cult of tradition.
Yep.
Rejection of modernism.
Just quickly on that one. The tradition is very different, isn't it, in America to Europe? So in Europe, it could be a traditionalist like me who
Enlightenment.
Yeah. Or it could be, someone like me who's nostalgic about small farms in Cumbria or the British Army or something. In America, tradition means revolutionary tradition. It means the right to bear arms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It means white.
And it means white, yeah.
We were looking the other day at those posters from the Department of Labour. I mean, they literally, this is about advertising jobs in America. The pictures they use literally look like 1930s Germany. I'm sorry. Blonde hair, blue eyes, that's the look.
And a lot of this,
2 kids, man, woman.
And some of this is conservatism from the 1930s in America, which was anti-New Deal, anti-Roosevelt, anti-what they saw as the liberal elite, very much against any attempts to help civil rights in the South. So it was racist and it was violent back in the 30s, and this is coming back again.
Yeah. Modernity, defined by the Enlightenment and rationalism, is seen as the beginning of moral depravity. Action and a can-do attitude are valued over intellect and reflection, for sure. Disagreement is treason. Critical thinking is seen as a threat to the movement's unity. What's he calling Marjorie Taylor Greene at the moment? Marjorie Traitor Greene. What was she a year ago? An absolute heroine. Fear of difference, exploiting xenophobia and racism. They do that. Appealing to a frustrated middle class. That's their working class. That's what they do. Obsession with plots. Enemies are both too strong and too weak. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. Contempt for the weak. Machismo. Selective populism. And then the final one, linguistic characteristics, using an impoverished vocabulary to limit critical reasoning and discourse. Well, he certainly does that. So I think, the question was, are we witnessing the birth of, Tony, you're right, Tony says to me, stop making comparisons with Hitler. But in terms of the attacks on judges, in terms of the attacks on the media, now including the BBC, not even his own media, but going global on attacking anybody that isn't just a bow-down sycophant, that is the birth of fascism.
And in Britain, we need to acknowledge that that's what Tommy Robinson is about.
100%.
There is a lot of whitewashing now happening of Tommy Robinson. A lot of people saying you can't call him racist, you can't call him fascist, because he's not Hitler. And when I challenged him...
Hitler wasn't Hitler until he became Hitler.
Absolutely. When I challenged Tommy Robinson on Twitter, we were talking about this on the tour. Immediately he came back. You talked about machismo from Umberto Eco. He said, Rory Stewart is weak spiritually, weak emotionally, weak intellectually, weak physically, right? It's all about strength. Again, when I challenged him back, his supporters come in and they say, you never answer any questions. Here are 2 questions to answer. Number 1, are there too many Muslims in the UK? Number 2, if there are, how many should there be, right? So I answer back, 1, no, 2, C1. And then unleashed on me is extraordinary abuse. But if you think about what would happen if you replace that word Muslim with are there too many Jewish people in the UK, are there too many black people in the UK, then you see where the problem is. And people are just not waking up to what Tommy Robinson represents and what this movement represents. We're endlessly whitewashing, endlessly. I keep talking to you. I'm getting more and more aggravated about this. I go and meet wealthy, educated people in Britain who are now saying to me things like, Hitler got the economy going and, maybe we need to sort things up. And I had a farmer in Cumbria met me in the street and he said, taxes are terrible. And I, as a good Tory, I was like, yeah, Labour taxes are terrible. And he said, well, I'm just asking you, but do you think we need a Trump? No, we definitely don't need a Trump. But this is becoming more and more mainstream. Finally on Marjorie Taylor Greene, she will matter because votes matter. In fact, for Trump, if he's a one-term president, he may not care too much about what's happening between MAGA and the Christian nationalists. But he's got to get stuff through Congress. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is a problem. She is somebody, just to remind people, when the 2018 California wildfire happened, she put forward the theory that this was a space laser fired by the Rothschilds. And this is why the California wildfire happened. When challenged recently about this anti-Semitic theory, she said she was unaware that the Rothschilds were Jewish. It was the first time she'd ever heard this. Now, she is now becoming somehow hero of anti-Trump people because she's calling out Trump on the Epstein files. But try to remember where she comes from.
Oh, yeah. She's also, she did an interview the other day where she was talking about the nature of the toxic discourse. And the interviewer said, but, you were fine with it until he started attacking you. And she said, yeah, except I was part of the problem. Either she's having to stick with the religious analogy, she's having a sort of road to Damascus conversion, or she's just decided, I'm no longer part of the in crowd. And she's now, because we're in this mad conspiracy world where those people get followers, she's now going to try and build her own base. But the fact that Trump was asked about her and said straight away, you know how good he is with nicknames, Marjorie Traitor Green, he's decided she's an enemy. And back to Umberto, my good friend and fellow European public intellectual, Umberto Eco, identifying your enemies and giving them no quarter whatsoever. And I think the thing is, I've reread that recently, that Project 2025 thing. If you look at it through the lens of where Trump might go, I think it's hard to escape the view that the people of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Bournemouth and London are right. That the better question will be, might we be? And a lot of that then depends on the response.
And this is where we have a slight disagreement with the rest of politics US, because I was struck by the fact that they've been saying he'll have elections, right? Of course he'll have elections. Mm. No, Hitler had elections.
Putin has elections.
Putin has elections. Or the populists in Latin America have elections. That's not the litmus test in the modern world. Yeah, elections will happen. The problem is what you do to all the institutions around. Mm.
And if you lose, do you accept it? Because back to 2020.
Which he certainly didn't in 2020.
Yeah. So we have spoken to...
Maybe well over 10,000 people. Yeah.
And and also we had this ModCon live polling thing. So they were able to, get onto a QR code and vote as we went. And it wasn't pretty viewing if you were a Labour supporter.
No, to summarise, we asked, for example, in Manchester, what percentage of the audience thought that Keir Starmer should lead Labour into the next election. I reckon I counted maybe 12 hands out of an audience. We had 2,600 people in that theatre. You thought maybe a bit more, but anyway, very, very small numbers.
Yeah. There was a bit of an Andy Burnham thing going on there.
There was an Andy Burnham thing. Which was
interesting.
Very interesting. We asked who thought Wes Streeting should lead Labour, and it was decent hands. Overwhelming support for Andy Burnham, which I thought was a good sign for Andy Burnham, because often a very good way of judging how someone does is by looking how their local constituency or their local city thinks about them. And there's been a concerted attempt, understandably, from Keir Starmer's team to discredit Andy Burnham and to mock him and to rubbish him. And I've got Labour MPs calling me saying, we don't even know who this guy is. He's some old guy who left Parliament years ago and he's relevant to us. It certainly was true in that audience in Manchester. A very, very warm feeling towards Andy Burnham.
I think the other question that we asked them was when we'd sort of talked about how disappointed they were with the government. We asked them, OK, let's just say the choice at the next election is between Keir Starmer still leading the Labour Party and Nigel Farage leading Reform UK. Regardless of what you want, and I imagine that most of the people who come to see us would prefer Labour to Reform, nonetheless, it was a very, very close call.
And I think actually in Manchester, it was something like 54% thought Farage, 46% Starmer.
I hated to see that when they were all totted up over the whole tour, it was 52-48, which of course...
It leads you to, triggers you and makes you want a second referendum.
It makes you want to stand up and make speeches about Brexit.
That's another thing about how astonishingly unpredictable and unstable British politics is. I mean, it's difficult almost to remember now that only a few months ago, Nigel Farage was seen by many people as a fringe figure who had tried to stand for Parliament on a number of occasions unsuccessfully, and who had gone through 3 different parties and had famous public breakouts. And the head of his party in Wales was under investigation for taking bribes from the Russians.
He's going to jail on Friday.
Going to jail because he's pled guilty, which means that we actually, in a way, are deprived of some of the details that we would have had if it had gone to court. And now a highly politically interested, motivated, educated audience now thinks in many different parts of the country, including Scotland, that Farage has a very decent chance of being the next Prime Minister. And that, I think, will connect us also to the question of what Labour does about immigration, which is, of course, one of the big things which is driving people to vote for Farage.
Yeah. I think the reason why things were particularly grim last week was because it was a particularly grim week. And I was, as you know, because you saw me in these private moments in our dressing room before, where I was, to get it out of my system, would regularly be sort of banging my head against the wall and just sort of saying, what the fuck is going on? So you had these 2 things coming on top of each other. First of all, we talked about last week, this thing of these crazy briefings from Number 10 saying that Keir Starmer's on jobs under pressure. West Streeting's about to make a challenge. I mean, nuts. Followed by this hokey-cokey on tax. So Rachel Reeves, who'd been out rolling the pitch, essentially saying to the country, without in not so many words, we're going to put your income tax up.
And just to confirm, again, we asked these audiences, usually audiences of 2,500 people, how many of you think that she's going to raise income tax? And almost every hand would go up. And I remember saying at the time, she's rolled the pitch, the public's expecting income tax to go up, and then we'd ask, how many of you are worried about the fact she's breaking a manifesto commitment? Very few hands go up.
I was stunned by that.
Well, and essentially, I think the calculation was that what really matters for Labour at the next election is a country that's doing well, an economy that's doing well, and it wouldn't defend them to say, well, we kept the manifesto, but the economy's all screwed up.
But does it mean that we're now in a state where the general regard for politics is such that people are not even shocked if you break a central manifesto promise? I was genuinely shocked by that. I mean, I think in Manchester and Glasgow, it was like a smattering of, when I said, and I really laid it on, I said, how many people in the audience think it would be really, really bad if the Labour Party broke a central manifesto pledge on tax? And it was just a smattering of hands went up.
Yeah. Well, I suspect it's because there's another part of politics where people want politicians to admit that they got it wrong. I mean, nobody thinks it's a good idea to just plough ahead with a stupid plan for 4 years because you said you were going to do it. And I think everybody has concluded that that tax commitment from Labour was mad. They shouldn't have made it before the election. And clearly, if they're not able to cut welfare, and I think maybe the backstory in this is that Labour's DNA is more left-wing. It didn't want a new form of mini austerity. I mean, without replaying the whole leading interview with Rachel Reeves, if you remember that interview, a lot of it was my saying, how on earth are you going to do this without raising tax or borrowing more? I mean, what you seem to be offering is a kind of continuation of austerity, and she tried to deny that before the election. Of course, the logic of that was clear afterwards, and must have been clear even to Labour activists and MPs before the election, that there was absolutely no way they could both say, we're not going to raise tax, we're not going to borrow more, and say we're going to get away from 15 years of Tory austerity.
Yeah. I mean, given, if it is true, and I still have my doubts, because I think it's one of those questions that in theory you might say, okay, but when it happens, it'd be such a big thing. And the Tories and Reform would hang it round their necks from here till polling day if they do break a fundamental manifesto promise on tax. But I think where I worry from their perspective, if they have now gone back on the idea of raising one of the big three taxes.
And it sounds like they have, right?
Which it sounds like they have.
Because it'd be completely insane to go, I mean, if she now raises income tax.
If we do hokey-cokey, then I think that's really pretty lethal.
Yeah.
There is, I think there will be stuff in the budget that we don't know about. Although it was interesting yesterday, I know we're going to talk about Shabana Mahmood again in a moment. Yet again, a major government policy announcement was preceded by the Speaker complaining about the extent to which Parliament hears about everything last. And I think there is something to do with that in the budget. And I saw Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, even had an urgent question on why do we keep reading about what's in the budget in the media when it should be Parliament first. But I think if we do end up going back to this tax tweak here, this tax tweak there, the risk with that is you end up with a kind of collection of measures which won't necessarily raise you loads of money. Maybe if they change the thresholds, it will, but otherwise won't raise you loads of money. But you set off all sorts of major campaign groups that then try and go for you. Whereas at least with a income tax, breach of the manifesto there it may be, people are clear about what it is. You can have an argument as to why you're doing it. I worry if they go back into the sort of pick off a bit of tax here, a bit of tax there, that it won't work politically.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's another problem, which is that, as usual, Rachel Reeves leaves herself very, very little headroom. I mean, the story from the beginning is she somehow had convinced herself before the election that they wouldn't need to raise employers' national insurance because there was enough money. Then she found there was a 20 billion black hole that she claimed she'd found from the Tories. So she used that as a reason to put up ENI. Then it turned out that, of course, the OBR figures were worse than she thought. And even at the time, people like Paul Johnson were saying, this is very, very risky. She's being much too optimistic. Public finances can go wrong by 10, 20 billion very, very easily. in the course of a year. She hasn't left herself much headroom. And sure enough, that's turned out to be true, because it turns out she needs tens of billions more.
Yeah.
The risk is that she will put together these small taxes and they will leave her still with not enough headroom. So she'll then be under pressure again in another budget to either borrow more or tax more, rather than getting the thing dealt with. And finally, I think the problem with the taxes that she's likely to pursue is they're almost certainly likely to be targeted disproportionately towards businesses, employers, entrepreneurs.
Who are already on the rampage.
Yeah. If I was going to return to our traditional position of disagreeing agreeably, which maybe we were criticised a little bit for in the show. We didn't disagree enough.
I still got a 4 out of 5 star in the Herald, even though they said that was a fault. We didn't disagree enough.
Well, let me try to disagree then. I would say that Labour is at risk of defaulting to its comfort zone, which is squeezing business, squeezing entrepreneurs, squeezing wealth creators, and that it's not doing what is a massive space now in the centre ground, which has been abandoned by Labour, abandoned by the Tories, abandoned by Reform, which is traditional pro-business, pro-market deregulation policies to get the economy going.
I was at a charity thing the other night, and there was a guy there who was a Labour donor. And as you know, we've talked before about this alleged exodus of all the wealth to Dubai, to Milan, wherever it might be.
And traditionally, while I've been grumbling about it, you've tended to say this is a bit overplayed.
I've said this is basically the tax avoidance industry at work. Yeah. And I think there's some merit in that. However, this guy, who's a Labour donor, said to me, if the budget hits me, as hard as the last one did, then I'm never going to go and live in Dubai, but I am looking to go. And I think they've got to be careful.
I'm hearing this even from Labour MPs, to be honest. A Labour member of Parliament was explaining to me from where he was the number of people who are now actively looking at moving to Milan in Italy, to Portugal, to Dubai. And part of the problem that Rachel Reeves is dealing with, for better or for worse, is that capital is much more mobile than left-wing economists really want to believe. They basically want to believe that you can keep taxing these people and they're not going to go. And the truth of the matter is, particularly with remote working and Zoom and new legal structures, it's much easier than it was in the past. People move. There's friction. You've got to move your kids from school. You've got to move your home. But people are definitely willing to do it. If they're high earners and this is costing them a lot of money, they will move.
Just to go through some of the numbers on some of these measures that are being talked about. And I think what may have happened, by the way, is I think the Office of Budget Responsibility, George Osborne's creation, which I think has just become too powerful within this debate. It's almost like, they decide what the budget should do. And I think what's happened is that Rachel Reeves has maybe had a slightly better than expected assessment by them of what she can do. And that's why she decided maybe we don't do tax. But if you go through some of the stuff they're talking about, the measures they're talking about on pension tax relief, under 2 billion, some possible changes to council tax, and depending what it is, it's impossible to work out what it is. But we're not talking multi billions.
We're talking here. I think we believe something like a few £1,000s on the most expensive properties.
Yeah,
but the interesting question is it a few £1,000s or is it tens of thousands of pounds a year on the most expensive properties? If it's a few thousand, she won't generate much money. If it's tens of thousands of pounds on the most expensive properties in London and the South East, then you do begin having a big effect on things like the property market, because you have, around here in London, older couples who have a valuable home but are living on a pension, don't have much income. If they're suddenly having to pay tens of thousands of pounds extra a year to keep their home, they'll put those homes on the market.
Yeah.
And the central London property market, some indicators down 30%. Some of the prices are where they were now 10 years ago.
And on the mansion tax, again, totally depends on what it is. But if it's roughly the sort of thing that Nick Clegg was trying to get through the coalition back in the day, then you're talking low number of billions. So these are all the sort of things that are being talked about, a tax here, a tax there. And I mentioned to you that Harriet Harman had got in touch with me saying, I can't believe you're so relaxed about breaking the manifesto on tax. I'm not remotely relaxed about it. I think there's always a political price to pay. But I think if we have another budget where it looks like, what will be identified as stealth tax, sleight of hand, all the stuff that goes with budget, you're far better to, given that one of their big things is we're going to stop sticking plaster politics, rip the plaster off and go for it. And the big thing is they've now got to develop a real sense of a strategy for growth, because I think that's the other thing that just hasn't felt like we asked the business audience recently, if I asked you to explain Labour's strategy for growth, what would you say? And they laughed. That's a terrible place to be in.
I think you're correct that if they'd broken the manifesto commitment, they would have been hammered for it for the next 3.5 years by the opposition. Labour can't be trusted. They said they wouldn't raise tax, and they did. But my guess is they're going to lose the next election anyway.
Ooh.
Keir Starmer's net popularity is down at -52. Even within Labour members, more than half of them now think that their leader should go before the next election. They've got to do something radical. My suspicion is, if they lose the next election, it's more likely to be because they've not made the right policy decisions, don't have the right vision, haven't got the country growing, than this attack line that they've broken their manifesto.
And I guess the reason why it's inevitable you will get leadership chatter when you have gone from a landslide to these catastrophically low poll ratings right now. I saw a poll the other day, and you've got to be wary with these polls because they just, some of them are just, they're push polling and that stuff. There's one the other day where the Greens were ahead of Labour. When we were in Scotland, there was a by-election in Ayr, local by-election, while we were there, and Labour came third behind the SNP and Reform. So this is not, I'm not pretending this is good. And there is no doubt there are MPs who are, because this is what happens in politics, and is that if this is like this, then leadership chatter is inevitable. It's inevitable. The question then is how you handle it.
And two things which I again strikes me about Labour. One is that it's much more difficult for Labour to get rid of a leader than it is for the Tories. Famously, listeners will remember with the Conservatives, we just have to put in a certain number of letters to the chairman of this mysterious 1922 committee, and that is enough to trigger a leadership election. And that's one of the reasons why Tories have been through, whatever it is, 5 prime ministers.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why Labour got elected with a landslide, because the public was sick and tired of them being changed and, just change the faces at the top.
So Tories' risk is we change the leaders too often and too ruthlessly. Famously, Liz Truss lasted, whatever it was, 47 days. But the risk on the Labour side is the problem that you had with Jeremy Corbyn, which is that the majority of Labour MPs came out publicly saying, we want rid of this guy, and they couldn't get rid of him.
So then they have to stand in the election and say, this guy's fit to be Prime Minister.
Yeah, so the mechanics of getting rid of Starmer are difficult. And the second problem is, even if they got rid of him and a candidate run, somebody like me is all for, someone like Wes Streeting. Oh, if you're Michael Gove, you sort of support Shabana Mahmood, right? But traditionally, those kind of blue Labour candidates, those kind of candidates on the right of the Labour Party, struggle to get through.
Yeah.
So it's not guaranteed that if Keir Starmer went, you're going to end up with, Wes Streeting or Andy Burnham. You might end up with something more exotic.
Which is not easy in these circumstances. And Angela Rayner, there's definitely a sense of Angela Rayner still thinks she's, could be in there. So the question for Keir Starmer is, how do you resolve this situation now? Assuming that he's not going to throw in the towel. I actually thought, though I say it myself, Rory, I thought in the couple of speeches I made on his behalf, neither of which he would make.
Just to explain, for people who didn't come to the live show, Alastair gave 2 speeches. In one of this, in his audition to be Director General of the BBC, basically he had Keir Starmer say, we love the BBC, we're defending it, and by the way, Donald Trump, you can bog off and leave us alone.
And they loved it.
They love it. And the second speech that you gave was a speech saying, I'm now admitted that Brexit was a catastrophic mistake, and I am going to introduce legislation for a referendum to rejoin the European Union. And that also was extremely popular.
Yeah. Well, you've got to do big things in politics.
Got to do big things in politics. That second one, I mean, if we really want to get a debate going with listeners, I imagine a number of people, both in the Labour Party and in Number 10, would explain why that might be a very, very risky strategy. But certainly it woke the audience up.
It might be a risky strategy, Rory, but how's the current strategy going?
I see. That's my view on the breaking the manifesto and the tax rises too. They've got to take some risks somewhere.
But I do think the quality that he has, which now has to be turned into something much more positive, he has got resilience. He has got resilience. That has got to be turned into confidence. And the confidence has got to be turned into courage. And I think there's that sense of, they don't look confident at the moment. Now, you could say, well, it's obvious why they wouldn't. But actually, they've got a big majority still. Use it. Be confident about making big change. I know you're obsessed with AI. I sort of worry that since Peter Kyle's been shifted, that debate, which is massive, it was leading the BBC News today with the head of Google talking about, AI might not be all it's cracked out to be. Where is our government in that debate? Where's our government in the debate about some of these big challenges? What did we really hear? Yes, Keir Starmer went to the COP. What did we really hear about the UK government and climate? These big, big issues. And the other thing, lesson from Mandani, never, ever, ever, ever lose sight of this issue of what he calls affordability and we call the cost of living. I just feel that there is an awful lot still to play for. The volatility that has led to them going like that, the same could happen to Farage. I honestly think, and we discussed this at all of the shows because I absolutely believe this to my core, Farage is utterly beatable if they start attacking him properly. And that doesn't mean doing all the stuff, he's never in part, he's never in Clacton, it's all that. You attack him on what he is, who he is, and what he stands for. And that is closeness to Russia. It is supporting Donald Trump while he's trying to destroy a great British institution like the BBC. It's having a best mate who's about to go to jail effectively for treason. Hit him on the stuff that the public are going to think, I didn't know that. How many people of this informed audience that came to us, we asked them, who's heard of Nathan Gill? Hardly anybody.
And it's the most extraordinary story,
and that's down to the media.
Nathan Gill has pleaded guilty to taking money from the Russian government.
And nobody knew who he was.
No, extraordinary.
One other lesson from last week, which I think is being learnt, is that all the briefing that comes out of Downing Street that is not being done through, with Keir Starmer's acknowledgement and permission, Tim Allen, the new Director of Communications, and his team has to stop. There are too many of them who go around thinking they're in a movie of their own making. They developed relations with journalists when we were in opposition, and they think those relationships should just go on. So they spend, their job may be in the policy unit, it may be in the private office, it may be all around the building, and they spend all their time talking to bloody journalists. It's not their job. Stop doing it. Shut up.
Absolutely. Sorry. Let's just finish with Shabana Mahmood's announcements on asylum reform. So this has been leading the media in the last couple of days. To remind people, this question of asylum seekers is absolutely central to so much of the political debate. Farage is running on it. The Conservatives are running on it. Labour initially said that the Tory plan on Rwanda was nonsense and that they were going to break the gangs. That was Keir Starmer's pitch, smash the gangs. And he made a big pitch of, I used to be Director of Public Prosecutions. I understand how to do this. I understand how policing hasn't really worked. Shabana Mahmood has therefore announced that she's going to make it much, much more difficult, both for people to appeal in the asylum process and make conditions much tougher for refugees in the United Kingdom. So their status will be temporary. It can be revised every few months. There's going to be many more restrictions on your ability to use arguments around family. More countries are going to be considered safe. Probably the best bits of it, the bits that from a technocratic point of view seem to work best, is to invest more in actually the asylum process, making sure there are actually proper courts, proper judges, they're getting through the backlog. But in the end, I don't think it's going to work, because in the end, I still believe that Gerald Knaus, who we interviewed on Leading, is correct, who is this extraordinary Austrian thinker who has set up the European Stability Initiative, began working in the Balkans, and who we interviewed on Leading, but who was also one of the key thinkers behind the EU-Turkey deal, which was about returning migrants to Turkey during the refugee crisis of 2015-16. That if we're serious about dealing with Farage, and if Europe is serious about making sure that we don't end up with a populist government in the United Kingdom, and I think it's in everyone's interest, then we have to get the returns back to France. We have to say, everybody who lands on a boat in the United Kingdom will be returned to France. France is a safe country. The safe third country return. It's an equivalent to the Rwanda scheme, but it's not Rwanda, it's France.
But Gerald Knaus, and it's really interesting how many people listen to that guy. I've had so many messages from, including people in governments in different parts of the world saying, can I be put in touch with this guy, Gerald Knaus? He sounds really interesting and what have you. But his big point is actually that, as you mentioned France there, he believes that the British government should be doing deals with individual European countries, particularly Germany, and he also mentioned Denmark, and we'll come on to Denmark in a minute, because ultimately the only deterrent is that is actually going to work is if you make that journey knowing that when you arrive, you get sent straight back.
Absolutely.
Because that is what happened with Turkey.
Absolutely.
And
it works, and as Gareth points out, with Turkey, there was something like 1 million people crossing the Mediterranean in a very short period. And as soon as the EU-Turkey deal was put in place, which basically meant anyone crossing the Mediterranean to Greece returned to Turkey, the numbers dropped to a few thousand in a month from 1 million.
I watched the whole, I don't normally do this, but we got back from Manchester and I went home and I actually watched the whole of the statement.
Oh, my Lord. When the rest of us sit and watch box sets, you're watching statements in the House of Commons.
I watched the BBC Parliament channel and I watched the whole thing from start to finish because, one, I wanted to see the extent of Labour backbench disgruntlement, which there's actually a bit, but less than I thought there might be. I also wanted to see how the Tories and Reform and the other opposition parties handled it. Interestingly, Kemi Badenoch, so it was Shabana Mahmood doing the statement. Kemi Badenoch
as
was
the leader of the opposition
for the Tories. It would normally have been Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary. And she actually was in a place of saying, far better than what went before. You're a lot better than Yvette Cooper at this job. Good start, got to go further. And then Reform, Farage and that lot, they were basically saying, looks like she's auditioning to join Reform. Then worst of all, to wind up Labour, Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, the self-styled patriot Tommy Robinson, came out and said, even though he thinks Shabana Mahmood isn't really British, he made that point in the Commons. He came out sort of broadly accepting. So I kind of watched the whole thing, and at the risk of triggering all of my family, because the family WhatsApp group was not happy about this policy, including over breakfast this morning with Fiona, who was still sort of mildly raging about the whole thing, feeling that this is just sort of playing to Reform, the issue's not really as big as people say, etc. I actually think that what she's trying to do is, and this is what Keir Starmer has told her to do, is get this off the agenda from the place where it is right now, almost at the top. In fact, in some polls you say it is at the top. And you do that in two ways. One, by fixing it, that's the most important thing. But also by showing that you're trying to fix it with something that's convincing and compelling. And I have to say, from watching her, and I was trying my best just to step back, from what she was trying to do, it was impressive. She really knew what she was on about. You really sensed she was sort of deep into the detail. And I think that one of the reasons why Labour's got themselves into a bit of a mess recently is a lack of clarity about where they're coming from and a lack of strength in how they project it. Now, it could all go tits up if there's a massive rebellion and they don't get it through Parliament. But my sense is that she did enough. And I had a message last night from a Labour MP who was more, positive's the wrong word, but when he spoke, it was, and I said, oh, surprised at your stance there. And he sent this thing, he says, and he's based up north. And he said, listen, we have got to fix this because this is the gateway issue to the hatred of us right now.
The problem is, though, I suspect that her policies will not significantly reduce the numbers. It won't be anything like as effective as Safe Third Country Return because many people, I'm afraid, will go through the asylum process. They'll be rejected and they will then choose not to return to their countries. They will avoid being forcibly deported. They'll disappear into the grey economy. They'll be supported by family. And what we will then have is increasing destitution. Because basically what she's doing is she's saying that if you've failed your asylum process, you're going to have less support on housing, education, employment, welfare. But for many people who've spent 2 years traveling from Sudan or a year and a half traveling from Afghanistan, they're still going to prefer to illegally stay. And provided they avoid getting arrested by the police and they don't turn up to their tribunals, they can often continue for many, many years to operate in the grey economy. But in desperate situations, they're lucky they'll have family supporting them, but they will be exploited by employers who will not pay them properly, who will make them work too many hours. That's the problem. We're not in a situation where when your appeal is refused, you're immediately put on a plane out. It's very difficult to get full figures on how many people stay when their asylum claim is rejected. we can see, for example, that there are about 100,000 claims a year and about 10,000 people leave a year. That doesn't necessarily mean that 90% of them staying, because some of these are claims from previous years. Nevertheless, there is a significant issue around people whose claim is rejected and who are not deported, because actually, generally, you get deported if you're in prison or the authorities can get you. Instead, those people choose to go into the grey economy, and then they're in a very difficult situation. It may not actually reduce the number of people claiming asylum that much.
One other thing we should put in the newsletter is a very interesting piece that Fraser Nelson wrote. And, I thought it was very interesting how the government deliberately set off this debate that we're modelling it on Denmark, centre-left government that's been very, very tough on asylum. And actually, Fraser Nelson's piece is really interesting because it shows 10 areas in which this is actually not nearly as tough as Denmark. And he's not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just very interesting that it's, you throw out a headline to the media and they go, oh, Denmark, 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 Denmark. And then nobody actually goes and bothers and looks at the detail.
Well, the small print century, you often talk about policies which get big media coverage, but actually in detail, not much happens. And a classic example with Denmark is that Shabana Mahmood has announced, copying Denmark, that asylum seekers can have their assets confiscated, like their e-bike, if they're not contributing towards their housing. Yes, that exists in Denmark, but apparently it's only happened 17 times since the law was introduced. There's only been 17 assets confiscated in Denmark.
And because in some cases it was their jewellery, this line ran here that Shabana Mahmood wants to take away your jewellery, and she was very, very clear in the House of Commons that is not what she was talking about. It was a really detailed piece. The other really interesting point he made is that he said Keir Starmer doesn't really like big policy debates playing out in public, but Shabana Mahmood has decided she's going to have a really big debate about this and she's going to see how it plays out.
Which is probably the right decision. Yeah. You've got to take some risk.
And what do you think of this? So one of the things that really seems to be winding people up is the idea that you get your status checked, with this great Home Office bureaucracy that never seems to be able to check much, every 2.5 years, and it's up to 20 years before you can get settled status. And I think the reason that Fiona and Grace in particular were getting really wound up about this is because actually when Grace was at primary school, some of her best friends were Kosovans who came here because of what was going on in the Kosovo War, settled here, and now, there's one family we know where they've got 3 kids, all of whom have, gone on to university, doing good things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this sense that, had we had this system then, they might have gone back after 2.5 years, 5 years, whatever it might be. So here's one for you. Let's just take something like Syria.
Yeah.
So there we are. We were in Syria with al-Shara. He was in the White House last week with Donald Trump, spraying him with perfume and sort of essentially saying this guy's great. Does that mean that Syria is now safe? And therefore, should all the Syrians who came into Europe, and many of them then also into the UK, that they now go back? Well, and if so, how?
Syria is safer because Bashar al-Assad isn't there, but there are still areas of Syria which are unbelievably dangerous that I wouldn't suggest anybody travels to. You've seen the fights with the Druze and the Alawites. There are ISIS Islamic State cells out in the southeast.
But that basically means we don't send anybody back to countries that are dangerous. Most of these countries, every country's got some danger.
Let me push further. Afghanistan. Afghanistan will be a really good test case for the way that Britain thinks about this. Afghanistan, in some measures, is safer, right? In the sense that I was back there in August. For the first time in 20 years, I can stop, have picnics on the roadside. The Taliban has significantly reduced the number of people being killed. There aren't terrorist attacks because the Taliban who were doing the attacks are now the government, and there's not fighting taking place. On the other hand, it is a patriarchal, chauvinistic regime severely repressing the rights of women. On the one hand, you could say, well, yes, you can go back to Afghanistan, probably go on holiday in Afghanistan, and you're not going to get killed. On the other hand, what do the British public think of women living in a situation like Taliban Afghanistan? What are the courts going to think? My answer to this is I think Gerald is right, which is the British government needs to say, in a big global refugee coalition, I keep coming back to this, share the burden, get Germany, France, Britain, Canada, everybody to sign up to say, we will take 0.05% of our population annually, and we'll take real people, female judges threatened by the Taliban in Afghanistan, but we will not accept anybody coming informally across on a boat. And if you could get that coalition together, get the new head of the UNHCR behind it, because they're looking for a new head of the UNHCR at the moment, rethink this whole...
Tom Fletcher.
He's already got a job.
He could have that one too.
He has that one too. I think there'll be a non-British person getting that job. Then there is a chance of doing this. And I think it makes sense for the whole world to do it together, because in every country in the world, this issue is leading to the rise of populism and even the edges of proto-fascism.
Yeah, but Roy, how do you do that in the context of climate, which is going to produce far more refugees than we have now? An American government, we're going to talk about this later, that is not even bothering to turn up to the G20 and not even sending anyone to the G20, didn't go to COP. So the idea we're going to get greater international cooperation at a time of this rising nationalism, I think it's going to be very, very tough to do that.
Well, this is the big trick, isn't it? To say, okay, America's isolated itself, and this is the opportunity for Canada, Europe, South Korea, Australia.
And do you try and do deals with China and try and get them to engage more positively on this kind of stuff?
Very sadly, China and Japan are very, very bad at taking refugees and asylum seekers. The number of asylum seekers taken in Liechtenstein is more than the whole of Japan. I mean, it's extraordinary. And then, of course, we don't talk enough about the fact that most of the burden is being borne in Asian and African countries. So Uganda takes millions of refugees. Many of the refugees from Myanmar end up in Bangladesh. Many of the refugees from Afghanistan end up in Pakistan or Iran. So there's a more complicated story here about developing countries or poorer countries taking a huge burden of refugees. Still, we cannot survive as liberal governments unless we put proper controls in our borders, which are humane and just, and take the people who we decide we can take. Let's say Britain took, 40,000 people a year. France took 40,000 people a year. Germany took 50,000 a year. The Netherlands took 20,000 a year.
And we're talking about refugees as opposed to those people who are coming and applying for jobs and getting visas.
We're talking about people who you could go out to the public and explain very clearly, this is the criteria on which we're taking it. We're sharing the burden with all other European countries. These are the kind of people, female judges from Afghanistan, for example, and we're not accepting people who pay people smugglers to turn up on boats.
Okay. Back to question time tomorrow. We're going to talk about China and Japan. That is kicking off a little bit since the election of a new Japanese prime minister. BBC.
Chile.
And we're going to talk about Mexico, and also this issue that is finally, it seems Netanyahu is calling out some of the activities of the settlers in Israel. And also, Rory, because it's all been a bit heavy, a bit of fun. As you know, because you were there every night, we started our shows with little films of this sort of small army of Rest is Politics impersonators.
Yeah, and one of them, of course, had I thought, the best joke of all, which is the fact that you always say that they get my voice much better than your voice.
But they do. They do.
What I then discovered is one of the reasons for this is that when I hear them, I start imitating their voice. I'm imitating the imitators.
You did on one occasion, yeah. No, I do have a very hard... I remember an impersonator. Rory Bremner used to do me and Tony Blair, and there was an actor called Andrew Dunn who did me, and I bumped into him once, and he says, you're very hard to get because your voice keeps changing a bit. And I have a mix. I have a bit of Scottish, a bit of Northern. I've lived in London most of my life. I don't really... Whereas all these impersonators do, if you said, let's have the poshest voice I can think of.
With a little bit of Mid-Atlantic.
And a little bit
of voice going up at the end.
Speaking slowly to foreigners, they do that as well.
Most difficult one of all, I think, is Nottingham in Britain. And we did that because we just did this wonderful interview on Punch, which is about to come out on Leading, this amazing play about a man who killed somebody with a punch and the extraordinary forgiveness from the family of the victim.
Yeah, that's out on Monday.
But that is all about this extraordinary story of training voices to deal with the Nottingham accent, which actually has very, very posh vowels in it, suddenly appearing unexpectedly.
Anyway, tomorrow, one of our impersonators apparently has asked us a question.
Very good. See you tomorrow.
See you then. Bye.